Anna is the professor in the Stanford School of Public Policy, and she's also has a appointment in the Department of Neuroscience and Psychology. And she has received the highly acclaimed Mavis Hetherington Award for excellence in applied developmental science. And that award is honoring her commitment to advancing the well-being of children and families and organizations throughout her scholarly contributions and in the field of developmental science and developmental psychology. So that's a really big deal, and we especially like the applied part of that. Jennifer Lansford is the S. Malcolm Gillis Distinguished Professor, a distinction that was bestowed on her just recently, and we're very excited about that. And she's also the director of the Center for Child and Family Policy, and she received the Mary Ainsworth Award. And that award acknowledges her exceptional scientific merit and groundbreaking work, which has opened new empirical and theoretical areas within developmental psychology and fostered interdisciplinary connections. So today, Jennifer is going to discuss child protection in the United States and internationally, because her work is particularly famous for her panel work in multiple countries, which is the project that's called Parenting Across Cultures. And it's a longitudinal study. As I said, it's a panel work in 9 different countries. And Anna's going to share research on work hours and income instability and how all that specifically also has been shaped by families' experiences with COVID. So that's it for me. I'll hold off. I'll try not to go back to the dessert tray and instead set it seat right here. I've now made myself accountable. So, and we are going to start with Jennifer. So please give Jennifer a big hand of applause.
Thank you so much, Dean Kelly. That's really kind of you. And thank you to Ken Dodge, who was really instrumental in these award nominations. And thank you to all of you for being here today and for being wonderful colleagues for years. And many of our collaborators from the Parenting Across Cultures team are here. So thank you for those research collaborations. I think my plan for today is this. So rather than going into any single topic in a lot of depth, I want to give you a broad picture of child protection internationally and the United States. So this is kind of what I'll walk through today, kind of starting with looking at United Nations child protection efforts, and then looking specifically at country legal bans, which is of corporal punishment, which is one way that countries have tried to enact in policy child protection efforts. Then moving into specific findings from the Parenting Across Cultures project, which is the longitudinal study that Dean Kelly was talking about. And oh, okay, there we go. Thank you. No, and then I'll talk about no-hit zones in the United States, which has been an effort because the United States does not have legal bans on corporal punishment. No-hit zones have been an effort that some communities have implemented instead of legal bans. And then talking about parenting programs, because if you think about ways to protect children, you can think about this from a policy perspective, but sometimes in the absence of or in addition to policies, you can also have programs that work directly with parents to try to improve parenting in some way that would ultimately protect children. So I'll start with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was has been the most widely ratified human rights treaty. This has been ratified by all countries except the United States. And it has several different provisions, but the one that's most relevant to child protection is specifying that children have the right to protection from abuse and exploitation. There are other rights that are outlined too, things like children have the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives. But I'll focus on this right to protection from abuse and exploitation today. So over the years, since 1989, there have been there were the Millennium Development Goals, now there are the Sustainable Development Goals, and these Sustainable Development Goals are what's driving the International Development Agenda through 2030. And the one that I'm going to zero in on today is related to number 16, peace and justice. And that has, as part of that Sustainable Development Goal, Target 16.2 says that the goal is to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children. And as of now, there are 65 countries around the world that have outlawed all forms of corporal punishment. And countries are targeting these legal bans of corporal punishment because the United Nations has specified that they consider any form of corporal punishment, no matter how mild, to be a violation of children's rights to protection. And so the graph down here shows the exponential growth in the number of countries that have outlawed all forms of corporal punishment, starting from the first one, Sweden, in 1979, up through 65 as of now. And I think there are a few notable things that are related to these legal bans that I'll talk about in the context of our Parenting Across Cultures project. This is the study that started in 2008 with recruitment of children who were 8 years old on average and their mothers and fathers in these 9 countries, the United States, Colombia, Italy, Sweden, Jordan, Kenya, Thailand, the Philippines, and China. And when we were originally choosing these countries, there were a lot of our initial research questions focused on discipline and effects of different forms of discipline in different cultural contexts. So Sweden, for example, was a country that we included because Sweden was the first country to outlaw all forms of corporal punishment. At the time that we were choosing countries, we selected Kenya because many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Kenya, had a lot of frequent and harsh forms of corporal punishment. I'm going to foreshadow a little bit here by saying that Kenya has now had a legal ban on corporal punishment, which set up a bit of an interesting natural experiment for us in the context of parenting across cultures. China was an interesting country to include because a form of discipline that's been called shaming is more common in China. And this is when parents kind of try to invoke a sense of shame in their children for misbehaving. So these kids were recruited from schools that were serving socioeconomically diverse sample or populations in each of these places. These are not nationally representative samples, so keep that in mind as a caveat in everything that I'm going to say. We did try to come up with locally representative samples. So for example, in Colombia, there are 6 well-defined economic strata, and people know which strata they're in. It's like on your utilities bill, it would say which strata you're in. So our sample there was recruited in proportion to those different groups' representation within the city of Medellin, which is where we were recruiting in Colombia. So not only were we recruiting participants from all of these 9 countries, but our research team includes people from all 9 countries. This is when we were meeting right here in October of last year. This is not everyone on our research team, but it's people from several of the countries on our research team. And at some point, you know, if any of you have questions about launching or maintaining international collaborative research, I'd be really happy to talk to you about that. I'm not going to be getting into that today. But having this international team has been a crucial feature of this work. So we're not kind of US researchers who are helicoptering into a different place to collect data and take it away. This has been a true international partnership with investigators from all of these places, from universities in all of these places. So I'm going to highlight just a couple of our project findings related to corporal punishment in particular. This slide shows data from 2008. So when we were first starting our project, the kids were about 8 years old on average here. And the main takeaway message from this slide is that the lighter blue bars show the whether parents reported using any corporal punishment in the last 30 days. The darker blue bars show the percent of parents or percent of families where one or both parents think it's necessary to use corporal punishment to rear their child properly. So a couple of things to point out. Sweden is not on this graph. We took great pains to make sure that even though spanking or all forms of corporal punishment are illegal in Sweden, that they would feel like they could report honestly what they were doing. We had them seal up their responses, send them directly to us in the United States so we could honestly say no one in Sweden will know how you're responding to these questions. But virtually no parents said they were using corporal punishment. No kids said their parents were using corporal punishment. So Sweden's not on this graph. But in all of the other countries that are represented here, more parents are saying that they use corporal punishment, then think it's necessary to use corporal punishment to rear their child properly. So that suggests to us that it's not necessarily that parents are using corporal punishment because they think it's the best way to discipline their child, but oftentimes are probably angry and are lashing out or don't know what else to do instead. And that's important for later when we start thinking about parenting programs, because it suggests that there might be an opening if parents knew something else that they could do instead, that they might be willing to do it. This is the finding that I was foreshadowing from Kenya. So if you'll recall, I mentioned that Kenya had a legal ban of corporal punishment in 2010. And so what this slide shows is the child age is on the x-axis. The proportion of different corporal punishment acts out of a list of 9 different ways that parents could use corporal punishment. Those include, it's a range of severity. Some of them are beating with an object. Some of them are, slapping across the face or on another part of the body. So it's a range of different types of things. But this shows that over time, you see this kind of knot point in Kenya that you don't see in the other countries. Kenya is the line at the very top. So you see, even when the kids were 8, parents in Kenya were using more forms of corporal punishment than parents in the other countries. But then right at the time of the legal change, there's this kind of decrease in the different types of corporal punishment that parents are using in Kenya, at least with reports. And that's something that is an acknowledged limitation of this. So if you know that something's illegal, you're also going to be less likely to report doing it, right? But we've been surprised over the course of this project how many illegal behaviors people have kind of reported engaging in. So this is not without its limitations, but we do see this kind of normative decline, as you'd expect, over time in parents' use of different forms of corporal punishment. And we see that in all of the countries. So, and that makes sense. As kids get older, their parents are less likely to use corporal punishment. But we see this kind of more dramatic drop in Kenya. So interestingly, our Parenting Across Cultures data then were used in a legal ban that happened in 2021 in Colombia. So now 3 of our 9 countries have outlawed all forms of corporal punishment. And I'm going to spend a couple of seconds reading what the language is in the Colombia legal ban, mostly because this is very similar to the language that's used in most countries that have outlawed all forms of corporal punishment. Obviously, this is translated from Spanish. Parents or individuals who exercise parental authority over children and adolescents have the right to educate, raise, and correct their children according to their beliefs and values. The only limit is the prohibition to use physical punishment, cruel, humiliating, or degrading treatment, and any type of violence against children and adolescents. So when countries are passing legal bans, there are usually 2 main kinds of arguments that are invoked in support of these bans. One of those is a human rights argument, and one of them is a scientific argument. The human rights argument goes back oftentimes to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, that children are people and have the right to be protected from all forms of violence. And some of the logic goes like this. There are laws prohibiting adults from hitting other adults. That would be considered assault. Kids are not allowed to hit other kids. Schools don't allow that. There are, ample rules against that. Adults don't tolerate kids hitting adults. So there's this weird exception that's made if adults who are stronger or more powerful are allowed to hit kids. And so that's the human rights perspective. To kind of illustrate this with one more example from the United States, it used to be that husbands were allowed to hit their wives. That's no longer considered acceptable or legal. And in many countries, husbands still are allowed to hit their wives, and it's still considered normative and acceptable. But in the United States, we've kind of shifted our perspective on that and now say, okay, we're not, women are people, they have the right not to be hit by their husbands, but we still have this exception in the case of kids being hit by their parents. So that's kind of a human rights argument. The scientific argument is that now hundreds of studies have demonstrated that more frequent use of corporal punishment or harsher forms of corporal punishment are related to worse child outcomes in a number of domains: aggression, anxiety, depression, worse parent-child relationships. And this is using a whole different variety of methods, using meta-analyses that pull together results from lots of different studies into kind of thousands of effect sizes. So the scientific evidence is now pretty clear on this. So because in the United States, we're still very far from legal bans, no states have outlawed corporal punishment in the home, and 17 states still allow corporal punishment in schools. And all 50 states allow corporal punishment in private schools, so it's public schools that's still allowed in 17 states. But there are some areas, mostly these have been implemented in hospitals, sometimes district attorney's offices. A couple entire cities have implemented what's called no-hit zones. And the idea with a no-hit zone is to try to have signage and rules for that particular location that don't allow any kind of hitting in that location. And so in part, the goal of these no-hit zones is to shift norms away from thinking that corporal punishment is okay. And the logic here is similar to smoking bans. So initially when people would smoke everywhere, that was considered more acceptable. Then you'd see signs and there would be no smoking zones, right, where you weren't allowed to smoke. And that was part of changing people's thoughts about the acceptability of smoking. The logic behind no-hit zones is kind of similar to that. So a fantastic honor student, Madison Mastrangelo, was the one who did this no-hit zone work for her honors thesis. And she did a really interesting analysis. So this is pulled from her honors thesis in 2018. She subsequently published the findings a couple of years after that in a journal article. But this shows a mapping of, as of 2018, where there were no-hit zones in the United States. These are not entire states, but it's the number of no-hit zones in a particular state. And the darker the blue, the more no-hit zones there were in a particular state. So there's some, geographical clustering for a variety of reasons. So this is something that is still kind of a growing movement, I think, but is no means pervasive across the country. But it's something that some communities and locations have tried to do in the absence of bigger statewide or nationwide bans. So that brings me to just touch briefly on parenting programs. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but there are a number of evidence-based programs that have been demonstrated pretty rigorously to reduce violence against children. A few of those are listed here. And generally, the goal of these kinds of programs is to provide some sort of training to parents in other forms of discipline, in positive communication, other sorts of things, with the goal of reducing parents' violence against children. Ken Dodge's Family Connect program is an example of a program that has a lot of great evidence that these kind of early nurse home visiting programs can do a lot of good at a whole community level in terms of reducing violence against children. And UNICEF has taken this on. I was a consultant on this UNICEF project. The full report is available for free download from the UNICEF website. But the UNICEF report has lists different standards for parenting programs, and kind of that can be implemented in a whole variety of international settings. But I think a big take-home message from this, as well as from some of the no-hit zone work, is that having an implementation science focus is really important here, because even though there are these various parenting programs, as on the previous slide, that have been demonstrated to be effective at reducing violence against children, there's a lot in the implementation that's quite difficult, that has to do with barriers to implementation and who's going to provide the staffing, if there are norms that are really ingrained in a community, how do you get relevant stakeholders on board to think that these things should be implemented? So I want to kind of leave you with that implementation piece. If you think about, child protection internationally, in the United States, even locally. And with that, I want to thank you for being here. Thanks to various funders. I'm happy to follow up with you, either chatting afterwards today or by email. Thank you. Now I really look forward to hearing from Anna.
Just want to echo Jen's thanks. It's a delight to see so many of you here. And a huge thank you to Ken Dodge, I think, for spearheading the nominations of myself and Jen, and just really honored to get a chance to talk to you today. So I'm going to talk today about the experiences of low-wage service workers with young children. And when I say service workers in particular, I'm talking about folks working in restaurants, food service, retail, and hotels. And I want you to take away three things. So if you have to leave or you get distracted by the sweets, you will have gotten the punchline. That is that parents working in the service sector who also have young children faced a tremendous number of challenges balancing their work and family roles prior to the pandemic. That the pandemic exacerbated these challenges. And that it also facilitated some unconventional policy responses that illustrate what we can do better as a society if we value helping low-wage working parents balance their work and family roles. But our policy interventions during the pandemic also shed light on ongoing inequalities that will need to be addressed moving forward. And I'm going to try to convince you of these three things using data from a study that I conducted with over 1,000 service workers with young children between the ages of 2 and 7 in the city of Philadelphia. So to set the stage in terms of the work and policy context that you might imagine as you think about the challenges that these parents are facing, in the United States, our social safety net is the strongest and most generous for those whose work is stable and predictable. Service work is characterized by instability and unpredictability, making the safety net more difficult to access for folks working in these types of jobs. And service workers with young children who can't be left alone are really where the conflict between the kind of idealized worker that we imagine in our mind here in the United States context, who is always available for work whenever their employer needs them, and who doesn't get paid when they're not needed or don't work, and our generally laissez-faire approach to how families meet their needs in terms of caring for young children kind of reach their most unnavigable point, so really come into conflict. Activists have been making this point for a long time, and before the pandemic, one of the ways that activists were trying to push for policy change that might address these challenges was to try to build momentum for regulating service workers' schedules. So there are on the books a set of so-called schedule stability laws in several large US cities and one state. And this was kind of the work and policy context that we were in as we were, unbeknownst to us, heading towards the pandemic. And that was the context in which I started this research project. So the goal of the research project when I started it was to understand the experiences of families who are strongly connected and attached to the labor force. So people who are working, who are trying to balance these competing demands, and to try to understand how they navigate low-wage service work and care responsibilities in this context. To understand and demonstrate the extent of the unpredictability and instability that parents in these jobs experience, how disruptions affect families on a daily basis. So when a work schedule gets changed unexpectedly, what happens? And whether laws to regulate unstable scheduling practices might help or might actually have unexpected or unintended negative consequences for families. And to do this, my colleague, our former colleague, Liz Anana, and I realized that we were going to need to collect our own data, that we were going to need to gather this information from a particular set of parents on a particular time scale, that is getting daily reports from them about what was going on at work with their work schedule, how they were feeling, and how things were going with their families. And we did this work in the city of Philadelphia for a variety of reasons. First of all, city of Philadelphia is one of our largest cities in the United States. It's diverse and multiracial, and it's a pretty typical American city in terms of its labor policies and regulations. So for example, the city of Philadelphia still has the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour. In a lot of the other cities that had tried to regulate work schedules, they were building on a set of other more progressive labor policies that had come before the work schedule laws, and that was not the case in the city of Philadelphia. So kind of a very different and interesting context. And the city passed what they call the Fair Workweek Standard in late 2018, and it was originally supposed to go into effect on January 1st of 2020. So you might be wondering, well, you needed to gather this data. How did you do it? And the answer is we found folks where they were working. So this is a map of the city of Philadelphia, and every single black dot on this map is a retail, food service, or hotel business. And we sent teams of researchers out to walk around the city of Philadelphia to talk to people in those businesses. So for example, I've now zoomed in to just one little subset of the city here in Old Kensington, and every blue flag on this map is, again, a retail, food service, or hotel business. And each day we assigned teams to go to one of these smaller areas and try to talk to folks. So for example, now zoomed in even farther in this Old Kensington neighborhood, this blue flag here is a Dunkin' Donuts. So we might have said, for example, okay, today you're going to start at the Dunkin' Donuts and you're going to walk this route generally counterclockwise going to each of these businesses. And the goal was to talk to as many people in that business who would be willing to talk to us, to try to identify folks who were working at that location at that particular time who had a young child between the ages of 2 and 7, and to try to recruit them into the study. We sent teams out around the city every day between very early August 2019 through the end of October. So we covered the literal entire city of Philadelphia, where we visited every retail, food service, and hotel business at least once during that 3-month period. And our staff did an amazing job. During this 3-month period, they talked to over 12,000 service workers. They identified among those, about 15% of them had a young child between the ages of 2 and 7, which is pretty consistent with other estimates, and successfully recruited nearly 70% of those folks into the study. So this approach, and I'm happy to answer questions about it over drinks or food, we argue generate a plausibly representative sample of workers in these locations in public-facing roles. We did not have great success trying to get access to the back of the house, as you can imagine. So folks who are cooks, for example, or doing stocking were much harder to access, and who speak English or Spanish. And what this means in the Philadelphia context is that there are some folks who otherwise would have been eligible, but who only spoke primarily Chinese or Vietnamese. So what does such a sample look like? Well, consistent with what I told you about Philadelphia, you probably aren't surprised to see that this is a multiracial sample. Just about half of the parents in our sample identified as Black or African American, a little bit over 22% Hispanic of any race, and then a mix of others. Consistent with identifying as a caretaker of a young child, the majority of the sample is female. Consistent with working in the service sector, these folks do not have very high levels of formal education, with the vast majority having a high school diploma or less. And as you can imagine, we're not making a lot of money. So the average monthly income for folks in our sample before the pandemic was about $2,200 a month. And so I also told you, okay, so we found the sample, and now we needed to get information about their daily lives. And we did this using text messages. So almost everyone in the United States at this point has some kind of mobile phone that allows them to send and receive basic text messages. And we were able to utilize that technology to ask these folks to answer surveys every day for sometimes 30 days in a row, sometimes 2 weeks. And we asked a host of questions about their work, whether they worked, what hours they worked, whether that was what was originally on the schedule or represented some kind of change, and then a set of questions about their own well-being and how their family was doing. So their parenting behaviors and how they thought their children were doing that day. So what we found before the pandemic in the fall of 2019 is not surprisingly that schedule instability was quite common among these families. So parents in our sample had some kind of change to their work schedule, whether that be a change to the hours that they thought they were going to be working, like being asked to stay late or being sent home early, like having a shift that was on the schedule canceled, or having a shift added to the schedule when you didn't originally have a shift on that day, was incredibly common. So we, across all the days, all the people, all the days, people had unexpected work schedule changes on 10% of days. And you might be thinking, maybe that doesn't sound like too bad, but that's 3 days out of the month. 3 days out of the month where you thought, I got a day off, and then you find out, oh no, I'm told I have to work tomorrow, or I'm at work and I'm getting sent home 3 hours early, meaning I don't get paid for 3 hours when I thought I was going to. And this has real consequences for parents' well-being in particular. So parents feel much worse on days when they have an unexpected work schedule change. Their own reports about their negative mood increased by 8 percentage points. So, and these are parents compared to themselves. So on a day when everything goes as planned with work, compared to that same family and their unique circumstances, on a day when there's a schedule disruption, parents' negative mood is much higher on days with a schedule disruption. Canceled shifts and those surprise shifts that get added on unexpectedly are particularly harmful for daily parent well-being. So here's another view of what was going on in 2020 before the pandemic. We happened to go back into the field to do another round of data collection that started on the 20th of February 2020. And I'm showing you two things here. So yeah, you know what happened. So this is the percent of the folks in our sample who were working that day. Just did they work that day? And that kind of has this undulating pattern because even in the service sector, folks are less likely to work on a weekend than on a weekday. So that's what explains that kind of up and down, but looking quite consistent. And this blue line is an index of family mental health that combines parents' reports about their own well-being as well as the reports about their children's well-being, which looks pretty flat in the lead up to what we all know happened, which is that on March 13th, 2020, because of the pandemic, the city of Philadelphia, like so many cities, implemented restrictions, stay-at-home orders, the closure of non-essential businesses, the closure of schools. And we were able to see in real time just how quickly the parents in our sample lost access to work, which again, remember means they lost access to take-home pay. So work dropped dramatically in the aftermath of those restrictions being put into place. And family well-being also declined, daily well-being also declined quite quickly once those restrictions were implemented. Oh, and also, the city of Philadelphia indefinitely delayed the implementation of the Philadelphia Fair Workweek standard. So we pivoted our entire project. That was what was going on before. We were in the field seeing this in real time, and we actually shifted the focus of our project to understanding what was going on with these families during the pandemic. We felt a scientific obligation to do this. We felt a personal obligation to try to make sense of what was happening in these families' lives in the context of a tremendous amount of upheaval. We were very fortunate that we already had this platform of conducting surveys using text messages that we were able to leverage to do many additional surveys with these families through the spring of 2022. So what happened to these folks during the pandemic? Well, most parents, many parents lost work. So remember, this is a sample that was 100% employed at the beginning of the study in fall 2019. When we surveyed them in, for example, in May and June of 2020, only half of them were working. At that time, 35% were unemployed, so they were not working, looking for work. 14%, that light yellow, were out of the labor force primarily because they were caring for their young children. And so over time, so I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs, and they're always going to move over time from left to right. That's like we're moving through the pandemic. And so the good news, I think, for these folks in terms of their access to work is that a lot of people got back to work. So by spring of 2022, 81% of the folks in our sample were working. But layoffs in particular were not experienced equally by all groups. And so across the first 2 years of the pandemic, nearly 27% of the Black participants in our study were laid off. 25% of the Hispanic participants were laid off, but under 20% of the white participants were laid off. So though many folks lost income during the pandemic, those who were not working lost more. So this is when we ask people to think about income from all sources. And on the left here are the people who were employed, and on the right, folks who were not employed. And the main thing I want you to take away from these side-by-side graphs is that the red bars, which reflect income loss, are always higher for the folks on the right, those who are not employed. There was a moment during the pandemic, you might remember, when people said, oh, people don't want to work, and we've made these benefits so generous that it's just better to stay home than it is to work. In terms of income, people can just rely on government assistance, and we do not see that in our sample. So the folks who are not working were always reporting more income loss than the folks who were working. The folks who were working, many of them still experienced income loss during the pandemic. Compared to those who were not working also had worse mental health. So across all waves, here the yellow bars are those who are not working, the orange bars are those who are working. Just a simple comparison, those who were working were at less risk of major depression and generalized anxiety than those who were not working. So the pandemic also made our safety net programs much more generous. And we find with our sample that those programs made a big difference for families. So in particular, pandemic unemployment insurance, our main social insurance program for those who lose access to employment through no fault of their own, was made much more generous in two ways. One is that eligibility was broadly expanded. So many more people were eligible for UI, and it was made more generous in terms of the actual dollars that people were able to receive. And what we find is that receiving basic UI was associated with less income loss and less depression and anxiety. So people lost less income and had fewer mental health problems when they were able to access UI. Receiving this generous UI supplement that we implemented during the pandemic was also associated with less income loss and less material hardship in terms of meeting basic needs like being able to pay rent and having enough food. However, and all racial and ethnic groups benefited from UI. So when folks were able to get UI, we see these similar associations across groups. However, we see stark and large disparities between groups in terms of who was actually able to receive their UI. So when we look at the folks who were laid off, and you can kind of think of these as a funnel. So on the left are the Black respondents. These are the Hispanic respondents of any race, and then the white respondents. These are our three largest racial and ethnic groups. So for example, the Black and white respondents are equally likely to apply for UI. Almost everyone who was laid off applied. But at the time that we surveyed them, among those who had applied, the Black respondents were much less likely to have actually received their UI check at that time than the white respondents. The Hispanic folks in our sample were less likely to apply and less likely to have received UI among those who applied. And so what this means is that when we look across all of our respondents at receiving basic and that supplemental, more generous payment, there are quite substantial differences in receipt of this generous UI benefit. What about the child tax credit, which we also made more generous and changed its structure for a brief 6-month period in the second half of 2021. Parents with children were able to receive their child tax credit as a monthly payment rather than a lump sum at tax time. In 2021, about 3/4 of our sample had received their monthly child tax credit payments, and you probably won't be surprised now to see that there were substantial disparities by race and ethnicity, where again, the white parents in our sample were more likely to have received their child tax credit checks than the Black or Hispanic respondents. But we find, again, for all groups, that the monthly child tax credit payments reduce material hardship, in particular food insecurity. So here's an illustration of that. This is the share of the respondents who said that they ran out of food last month, starting in the early days of the pandemic in May and June of 2020, and again, moving over time from left to right. And here's the key difference is that in the second half of 2021, when we were paying that CTC monthly, food insecurity, that's running out of food, was much lower for those who said that they had gotten their CTC compared to those who hadn't. We also find that the lump sum payment that came the second half of the CTC that came in spring of 2022 at tax time was related to reduced parental depression. Oh gosh. So that for each $1,000 in CTC, oh my gosh. Payment, depression decreased by 3 percentage points, which reflects about an 8% reduction in the likelihood of major depression from a pretty high base rate. Remember, these are folks who have a lot of challenges of 38%. Okay, so to summarize, the work, context, and policy regime prior to the pandemic were unpredictable and unstable for many service workers with young children. The pandemic made work even more unstable, leading to income loss and mental health problems. And instability in care in school also played a role. But the pandemic also facilitated a more generous policies, which were effective at reducing material hardship and mental health problems. But structural challenges that predated the pandemic made access to these pandemic-era supports uneven, with white parents having more access to these benefits than parents of color. Generous income supports, like we see from this expanded UI and from the more generous child tax credit, can help promote family well-being. But these more generous programs were temporary. They were in response to the pandemic. And so making their expansion permanent is going to require some political will. If this is something that we want to try to do, we're going to need political will to do it. And similar to Jen's two ways of thinking about this, I think there's a moral appeal here, which is we should help children because we should care about children, especially those who are in economically precarious circumstances. But there's also a more practical appeal that we could make, which is by helping children now, we're investing in the adults of tomorrow, which benefits all of us. It's also the case that policies that are implemented without an explicit focus on reducing structural inequalities are likely to perpetuate disparities in access and receipt. And so these structural barriers prevent parents of color from fully benefiting from these more generous policies, which potentially perpetuate a cycle of inequality. And so if we care about reducing these racial and ethnic disparities and want to try to ensure that everyone who is eligible for these programs has access, then we really need to pay additional attention to addressing structural inequalities when we think about policy implementation. And I too will conclude by thanking the tremendous number of funders and the huge number of people who made this work possible, including several public policy undergraduate students, MPP students, and PhD students who were involved in various aspects of the data collection, data cleaning, data analysis, and writing. Thank you.
So we forgot to tell you, as in a true experiment, we didn't tell you that we actually had a brain-machine interface experiment going. And for one of you, this worked. So you're really good mental talent. And so we do have time to take just a couple of questions, maybe two for each or something like that. So I'll just give that opportunity if folks have any questions they would like to ask. Erica has a question.
Did you? Yeah. What was it within the family of color and including the Hispanic families as well? Well, other than the application, or assuming that these are colorblind or something?
Great question. So we don't really know, but I will speculate about a few things. So in terms of UI, a few things to say. One is that actually Pennsylvania is known to be a state that's pretty good at getting people their UI, and yet we still see these disparities. In non-pandemic contexts, some of the reasons that are given are things like, for all of these same structural reasons, people of color have more unstable work hours, which makes determining eligibility more difficult. And that's probably also true in the pandemic context, right? So if you, without good, the eligibility is based on hours worked and earnings in some period before you're applying. And so people who have more unstable work, it's harder to demonstrate eligibility. Sometimes there are reasons why employers can contest UI claims. So just like, if you get in too many car accidents, your premium goes up. If employers have too many people that they've laid off, their premium can go up. And there is some evidence that there are disparities in which claims of whom do employers contest. So that's another reason. In the pandemic context, there was a shift away from in-person, obviously, applications towards applications that relied on technology, and there remain disparate access to technology and like stable high-speed internet, for example, to complete an online application. So, we don't know for sure, but those are some of the reasons. I will say that ultimately, people do tend to get their UI checks like at the end of the day, but when you need to pay your bills or feed your kids now, if you haven't gotten your check, it can make a huge difference. And then the other thing is that for the Hispanic families, again, we don't know for sure, but there's almost certainly a chilling effect of folks not wanting to apply for government assistance because they're concerned about their immigrant status or a way to citizenship being disrupted.
Thank you.
Great. Other questions? Yes. All right.
One of the things you wanted to look at was whether in the states that passed laws that restricted schedule changes had any impact. Was that any part of some of your surveys or not yet?
Well, I'm laughing only because that's, all that grant writing was all about understanding the effect of this law on these families, and then the law wasn't implemented. Ultimately, it was implemented, but in such a challenging context, it's kind of hard to understand. So a couple things to say about that. So we did a much smaller scale version of the study in the city of Emeryville, California, which is in the Bay Area, where we did find that the Emeryville Fair Workweek Ordinance reduced instances of the kinds of harmful work schedule disruptions. And improved parent well-being. And I'm happy to talk to you about the details of that. But so there is some evidence that this kind of scheduling regulation can help. So our findings in Emeryville are consistent with work by others in Seattle, for example, that show that those regulations can reduce schedule disruptions and some of this unpredictability. The implementation in the city of Philadelphia was extremely weak because of the pandemic. So even when they did when the law finally was being implemented, the city was obviously pulled in a lot of different directions, and enforcing the Fair Workweek standard was not very high on their list. So when we asked folks about the extent of implementation in their workplaces, we see pretty low levels of implementation. And the way all these laws work is they rely on worker-based enforcement, which just means workers reporting their employers. And so especially in the pandemic context, so that's really challenging anytime, and a lot of the labor organizers like what they take on after they advocate for these kinds of laws is then working with their members and with workers to advocate for themselves and to report when they know their employer is not in compliance. It's really hard to do in a context when access to work has become so challenging.
All right, I'm seeing 4 questions. Does anybody have a question for Jennifer? Okay, Sunny, why don't you go?
So, could you clarify what happens in, say, a no-hit zone if there is some hitting? Who tells whom, and then what happens?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Does the child have to report it?
The child does not have to report it, although that actually Joseph raises actually a different set of interesting issues. But typically what would happen in a no-hit zone is that the staff, like if it's, they're most common in hospitals or kind of practices, so then it would be upon whoever's the staff member there, if it's a nurse or a receptionist or someone to intervene. But that's been a big barrier to their implementation because different places that have implemented no-hit zones have varied a lot in terms of what training has been provided to people who are expected to intervene if they see hit. And you can imagine, I mean, that's a very uncomfortable thing for someone to do, to come up to someone and, you know, say, hey, I noticed you were hitting your kid. You know, you shouldn't be hitting your kid. Or so, you know, but yes, it would typically be whoever is on staff in that location where the no-hit zone is in place who would be expected to intervene. The thing about kids reporting is a whole other issue. So in theory, kids could have reported, but that wasn't part of that was the time so that it kind of adjusted.
Lisa?
Yeah. So first of all, bravo to both of you. Congratulations on the award. And I am thrilled to be here celebrating with you. I wanted to bring it back to the topic of this entire celebration and have you both speak for a moment about psychology and public policy. I know I've enormously benefited, not trained as a psychologist. Yeah, I was thinking of like 3 pieces of writing with you just in the last 2 years that have really, you know, bridged, that have been enormously sort of generative and creative in addressing these big important questions. So I wanted to give a moment for each of you to reflect on, and the school is so unique having developmental psychologists mingle with all the rest of us. So I would love a reflection from each of you about what it means to be a psychologist in the School of Public Policy and how important that is.
So that's a great question too, Lisa. So I think from my perspective, and not just from my perspective, I think a lot of the major developmental organizations, the Society for Research and Child Development, for example, kind of the premier child development organization, there's a big emphasis within that society, both on interdisciplinary work. Interdisciplinary work is part of it, and also a big policy focus. So I think at least within psychology, there's this kind of groundswell of interest in people being trained on how to either communicate with policymakers or influence policy in various ways. So certainly from the psychology point, there's a real desire to make that happen. And I think interdisciplinary is really critical because if people are siloed and working just within their own discipline, they're really missing a lot by not, you know, kind of collaborating across fields. And I think that kind of training that people in different disciplines get is different. You know, I've learned that, you know, from working with economists, for example. You know, we may be talking about the same things, but using different language or things like that. But I think there's certainly a lot of value in finding out, okay, what do these different disciplines think is strong evidence for or against a policy, and I think ultimately by being able to kind of discuss things across different disciplines right now.
So I never volunteered to follow Jen Lansford. Everything Jen said, I agree with. One will add, I mean, I think, you know, taking a moment to reflect on, you know, what am I doing here in the School of Public Policy, and why do I care about placing this work here at Stanford? So one of, you know, one of many theories of human development that students learn when they're in an undergraduate developmental psychology course or in a PhD program in developmental science is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. I see some nodding, right? So this idea that children are nested within this kind of set of contexts that are all influencing their development. And the most important are the ones that are closest to the child, like their relationship with their parents and things that are going on in their home. But there are these other things going on in their broader world that also make a difference. And that's where I really place myself. And that's an exciting place to be. This is an opportunity to add to the science by really thinking about, okay, well, parents are outside the home. They're not with the child in these workplaces, right? They're their own individual people having these experiences in workplaces. And yet what happens in those parents' workplaces where the kids never go, right? Actually ends up mattering for how parents interact with their children and how children are doing. And so, and then we layer on top of that public policies. We made these huge changes to how we provide income support to families, and that really ends up mattering for family well-being. And so, I think in terms of building our theory, a lot of times being in an interdisciplinary space and being in a space where we get to think about those other layers of Bronfenbrenner's model, I think has been really exciting for me personally.
I think you complement each other very well. You don't have to worry about who's following who. I know we're pushing the clock, but I do want to allow just one more question. I think, Abdullah, you had been wanting to ask.
My question is for Anna. All the cities in one state who passed these laws are blue states.
Yeah.
Is there a significant partisan breakdown, or there's a cross-party imagination or thinking about this issue? And where does North Carolina laws vis-a-vis those has passed?
Oh, great question. So, the easy part first. So North Carolina doesn't have anything like this. And not only that, the state of North Carolina explicitly prevents cities from implementing something like this. So even if Durham or Raleigh or Charlotte wanted to pass a scheduled stability law like the ones that are on the books in Seattle or Philadelphia, they are prohibited from doing so by the state. So that's the North Carolina context. I mean, I think the story of these laws and how they came to be is really a story about labor organizing. So the unions in these places where there's strong union presence, especially relative to like North Carolina, right? They have really been at the forefront of getting these laws passed, and so that's why in most of the places they came on top of other things. So it's like, where the unions oftentimes started with something that was concrete, really easy to digest, really easy to communicate, like fight for 15. Raising the minimum wage is very simple and easy to communicate. And when they had success there, they were then able to kind of talk together, the organizers and the workers work together to think about, okay, what do we want to tackle next? And a big issue for service workers are these exact things of schedules being unpredictable and unstable. So the policy remedy turns out to be a lot more complicated. I didn't go into the details, but the way that you might regulate these is actually really complicated, and that's why it has tended to come after things that are relatively easy to communicate and relatively easy to implement.
Thank you so much. I know that there were more people who wanted to ask questions, but I hope that you all feel free to linger, avail yourself more of the food in the back. And I know that I speak for all of us when I say just how proud we are of both of you and how glad we are that you are here with us at Duke. So please, everybody, a big hand.